Have you ever stumbled upon an old photograph and felt an eerie pull toward the eyes looking back at you? A face frozen in time, smiling, yet somehow distant, like it knows something you don't. Now imagine that photo belongs to someone who vanished under circumstances so strange, so quietly disturbing, that even over a century later, no one can truly say what happened. That's the story of Matilda Hacker, a case so hauntingly obscure that it's barely mentioned today, yet so mysterious. It still lingers like an unfinished sentence. It was the summer of 1886 in Philadelphia, a city bustling with the clang of streetcars and the hurried steps of progress. But while society pushed forward, something deeply unsettling was unfolding behind closed doors. Matilda Hacker was young, hopeful, and deeply rooted in a tight-knit family. And yet, one day, she simply disappeared. No final goodbyes. No confirmed sightings. No body. Just gone. This isn't a story of high-profile suspects or tabloid headlines. In fact, Matilda's case received only passing attention, even in its own time. That's part of what makes it so chilling. No outcry, no justice, no closure. Just silence, the kind that grows heavier with each passing year. And as we trace her final known steps together, you might find yourself asking, was this the work of someone she trusted? A crime of opportunity? Or something stranger, something that slipped through the cracks of time entirely? Over the next few minutes, we're going to unravel the few fragile threads left behind. We'll walk through the alleys of history and the whispers of old newspaper clippings, where Matilda's name occasionally flickers like a fading candle in the dark. We'll listen to what little was said, and just as importantly, notice what wasn't. The case of Matilda Hacker remains an unsolved mystery to this day. A cold case that's nearly been erased, save for a few faint records and the growing curiosity of those who stumble across her story. More than a century later, could it be that answers were buried long ago? Or that the truth was never uncovered in the first place? In this quiet, haunting investigation, we invite you to look deeper, not just into the facts, but into the strange silences they leave behind. This is the forgotten case of Matilda Hacker, and it still echoes. Before her name faded into the footnotes of history, Matilda Hacker was, by all accounts, a quiet presence in a world just beginning to move quickly. Born in 1866, just 1 year after the Civil War officially ended, Matilda entered a country that was rebuilding, reshaping itself from division, scars, and sweeping change. But in her small corner of Philadelphia, life moved slower, simpler, safer, perhaps, or at least it seemed that way. Matilda was 20 years old when she disappeared, a young woman on the cusp of adulthood. Her family lived in the Southern District, not far from the Delaware River, in a modest row house tucked among cobblestone streets and narrow alleyways. Her father, John Hacker, worked as a cabinet maker, skilled with his hands and known in the neighborhood for his discipline and quiet pride. Her mother, Anne, stayed at home, as most women did at the time, managing the household and caring for Matilda and her 2 younger brothers, James and Samuel. They were, as best we can tell, a working-class family. Not destitute, not wealthy. Ordinary in a comforting way. You can almost picture it, can't you? The sound of the wooden door creaking open on a hot summer day. The clatter of dishes being washed after supper. Neighbors calling out greetings as they passed by. It was a life built on routine and familiarity, the kind of life where everyone knew everyone else's business, which is what makes what happened to Matilda even more difficult to grasp. From an early age, Matilda was described as thoughtful, even shy, not withdrawn, but careful with her words. She had a love for needlework, often stitching embroidered patterns onto handkerchiefs or pillowcases. A few pieces survived, delicate, intricate work that showed patience and a steady hand. Sewing wasn't just a chore for her. It was something she enjoyed, something that gave her quiet satisfaction. She was also said to have loved reading, particularly romantic novels and serialized stories in women's magazines. That's how she learned about the world, not from travel or schooling, but through fiction. In that way, she was like many young women of her time, living in a confined world, yet dreaming beyond it. Those dreams, however, were tempered by the expectations placed upon her. Marriage, family, duty. That was the path laid out, and she walked it without complaint. By 1886, Matilda was still living at home, unmarried, which wasn't unusual. But at 20, it did raise a few eyebrows. Some reports suggest she may have been courting a young man named Edward Fleming, a clerk who worked at a nearby dry goods store. But nothing official was ever announced, and no engagement followed. Others claimed Matilda had grown more reserved in the months leading up to her disappearance, quieter, more introspective. Was it just the weight of adulthood, or something more? We'll never know for certain. But what's clear is that Matilda was loved. Her parents, despite the rigid norms of Victorian family life, seemed protective of her. Her brothers adored her, especially Samuel, who once described her as the gentlest person I've ever known, according to a later family account. She wasn't the type to make waves. She avoided gossip. She obeyed curfews. She helped her mother cook. She went to church every Sunday, in essence. Matilda Hacker was the kind of person we might overlook in the annals of history, because she didn't seek attention. She blended into the rhythm of daily life. She was never loud, never disruptive. But perhaps that's why her story cuts so deeply now. Because when someone like that disappears, someone whose very nature is to remain close, grounded, safe, the absence feels even sharper. It's as if the universe made a quiet mistake. As if someone slipped away who never should have. There were no hints that anything was wrong. No signs of a scandal. No known arguments. No run-ins with danger. She hadn't run away from home, and she wasn't the type to rebel. Even Edward Fleming, if their relationship was real, never reported anything strange. Matilda simply vanished, and yet, even in her absence, she leaves a vivid impression. We imagine her at the window, watching the horses pull carts through the street. We picture her sitting by candlelight, stitching careful initials into linen. We hear the rhythm of her footsteps across the wooden floorboards of that narrow home on South 6th Street. And we feel the weight of her silence, still hanging there like dust in a sunbeam. To truly understand the mystery that would follow, we first have to understand who Matilda Hacker was. Not just a name in a forgotten file, but a daughter, a sister, a quiet soul with gentle hands and dreams stitched into every thread she touched. And that's what makes what happened next so unthinkable. It was the kind of morning that didn't hint at anything unusual. Just another quiet Tuesday in June of 1886 in the heart of Philadelphia. The air was already warm by 7 a.m., with the smell of bread drifting from nearby bakeries and the clatter of wagon wheels, beginning their familiar churn along South Street. For the Hacker family, the day began like countless others. But by sundown, Matilda would be gone. It started with breakfast. Matilda had risen early, around 6:30 a.m., according to her mother Anne's later testimony. She helped prepare a simple meal of cornmeal porridge and tea, served it to her brothers, and sat quietly at the table while John, her father, read a newspaper aloud. There was nothing out of the ordinary. No tension. No mention of plans. Just the calm rhythm of family life around 8 o'clock a.m. Matilda changed into her walking dress, a modest blue cotton gown with a white lace collar. She pinned her hair back and tied her boots, all as usual. Before stepping out, she told her mother she was going to run an errand, possibly to pick up thread or fabric from Mrs. Lone's drapery, a store just a few blocks west. It wasn't unusual. She'd gone alone many times. Still, Anne asked her to return before noon to help with lunch. Matilda smiled, nodded, and stepped outside. That was the last time her family ever saw her. Witness accounts place her heading west along Christian Street around 8:15 a.m. A neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Riggs, saw her pause briefly at the corner near St. Paul's Church, seemingly adjusting her shawl. She was alone, calm. No one appeared to be following her, but something strange happened next. At 9 a.m., the clerk at Mrs. Lone's shop, Margaret Doyle, later reported that Matilda never came in that day. She even double-checked with her employer because Matilda had been a regular customer. "We always chatted when she came in," Margaret said. But that Tuesday, she never showed. So if she left home at 8 a.m. and was expected at the drapery store by 8:30 or so, where did she go? More confusion surfaced when a local postman, Thomas Leary, claimed he saw Matilda further west, near the Schuylkill River, well out of her usual path. It was sometime between 9:15 and 9:30 a.m. He didn't speak to her, but said she was walking alone, looking down, clutching her shawl tightly. That sighting, if accurate, pushed her route nearly a mile off course, in a direction she had no known reason to go. The first sense that something was wrong came around 12:30 p.m., when Matilda hadn't returned for lunch. Her mother waited another hour, thinking maybe she had been delayed at the store or stopped to speak with a friend. But by 2 p.m., concern turned into action. Anne sent Samuel, then just 12 years old, to check the shop and the surrounding blocks. Samuel came back pale-faced. She wasn't there. Mrs. Lones hadn't seen her all day. By 4 p.m., John Hacker left work early to begin searching. He walked from 2nd Street to Broad, retraced Matilda's usual routes, and even checked the small library annex she sometimes visited. Nothing. No one had seen her. No friends. No shopkeepers. It was as if she had evaporated between two corners of a street. That evening, as dusk settled over the city, the Hackers contacted the local constable. A formal missing persons report was filed shortly after 8 p.m., one of the first of its kind in that district. The authorities initially suggested she may have run away, possibly due to a lover's quarrel or personal troubles. But her family insisted otherwise. Matilda had left no note, taken no extra clothing or money, and had made no mention of distress. Still, the theory of elopement lingered. Whispers started. Some pointed to Edward Fleming, the rumored suitor. He was interviewed the next day and denied knowing anything. "I haven't seen her in weeks," he said. "We spoke briefly at church, but nothing more." He appeared genuinely surprised. He even joined one of the neighborhood search parties the following weekend. And then there was the shoemaker, Peter Walton, who worked from a small stall off Passyunk Avenue. He claimed he'd seen Matilda speaking with a man in a dark coat and bowler hat near the South Street Bridge around 9:45 a.m. The man had placed a hand on her arm, gently but firmly, as if trying to convince her of something. Matilda, he said, looked uncomfortable, almost frightened, but Walton's memory was vague. He couldn't recall the man's face. And no other witnesses came forward to corroborate his story. By the end of that week, posters with Matilda's likeness, a hand-drawn sketch based on a family photograph, were placed in shop windows, at railway stations, and even ferried across the river to Camden. Search teams combed the woods and waterfront. The river was dredged. Wells were checked. But not a single trace was found. No footprints. No items of clothing. No final words. Just silence. It's this silence that still echoes, nearly 140 years later. Because unlike stories where answers eventually emerge, where a clue falls loose, or a secret is revealed, Matilda Hacker's disappearance holds steady in its stillness. The day she vanished remains a timeline riddled with contradictions and uncertainty. She stepped out into the sunlight, walked down familiar streets, and somehow never came back. And you're left wondering, as we all are, how can someone disappear in broad daylight, in a place they know so well, without a single trace? When a disappearance like Matilda Hacker's strikes a quiet town, the first hours can often determine everything. Yet, in this case, the early hours were muddled with uncertainty, missed opportunities, and vague recollections. The investigation officially began less than 12 hours after Matilda was last seen, and from the outset, it carried the scent of something unusual, like the authorities knew they were already too late. Local police arrived at the Hacker residence around 7:20 a.m., responding to a call placed by Matilda's mother, Lydia, who reported her daughter missing from the family home. Matilda had not shown up for her shift at the library, and her phone went straight to voicemail. Her bed was unslept in. Her shoes were missing, but her jacket and purse were still on the hook by the door. It was a cool spring morning, the kind that called for a sweater or light coat, yet Matilda had taken neither. Officers canvassed the immediate area, questioning neighbors who might have seen her leave. One elderly man, who lived across the street, mentioned seeing a woman fitting Matilda's description around 6 a.m., walking swiftly down Birchwood Avenue toward the old bridge. She looked like she had somewhere to be, he'd said, but no one else saw her after that. No traffic cameras, no store surveillance, no confirmed sightings. Just silence. Investigators quickly turned their attention to those closest to her. Lydia and Frank Hacker were interviewed separately, and their statements reportedly aligned. Matilda had seemed tired the night before, but otherwise normal. Her laptop was still open on the kitchen counter, her favorite tea mug beside it, half full. The browser history showed she'd been looking at historical archives for her research. Paper nothing unusual. Detectives combed through her digital life. Texts, emails, social media. There were no signs of planning a departure, no cryptic messages, no complaints of being followed or threatened. The only slight curiosity came from a short message she had sent to her friend, Clara, around 9:12 p.m. the night before. It read, "I think someone's been in my room again." Clara would later confirm that Matilda had mentioned similar feelings before, but brushed them off, blaming her own forgetfulness, perhaps a creaky old house. Still, that message would become a chilling thread in the investigation. Authorities brought in tracking dogs the following day. They picked up a scent trail from the front steps leading toward the wooded trail behind the house, then nothing. As if Matilda had vanished into thin air. By the end of the first week, the FBI had been called in to assist. It was rare for them to get involved so early, but something about the case was off. There were no ransom notes, no signs of struggle, and no logical reason for her to run. As the media caught wind of the case, local stations began airing coverage. Young historian vanishes without a trace. Flyers with Matilda's photo smiling. Bright-eyed were posted in store windows, pinned to telephone poles, shared across every social feed in the region. But tips were sparse. Several individuals were questioned multiple times. Clara, the close friend who had received the cryptic message. A library co-worker named Josh, who had once been romantically interested in Matilda, but whom she had reportedly rejected. A former professor who had been overly familiar with her in past emails, though he denied any recent contact, despite combing through hours of CCTV footage from nearby streets. Gas stations and bus depots, nothing concrete emerged. One grainy image from a camera near the park entrance showed a figure that might have matched Matilda's height and hair, walking near the edge of the woods. But the timestamp was off by nearly 30 minutes from the last confirmed sighting. No certainty. No proof. A few weeks in, a search team found a torn piece of fabric snagged on a low branch deep in the woods navy blue, like the cardigan Matilda was believed to be wearing. Forensic testing revealed it did contain traces of her DNA, but that only deepened the mystery. Why would she have been so far from the house? And how did she get there without anyone seeing her? What was particularly frustrating for investigators, and heartbreaking for her family, was the lack of a clear narrative. No signs of foul play, yet no evidence of an intentional disappearance. Her bank accounts remained untouched. Her passport was still in the drawer. There were no mental health red flags, no suicide notes, and no history of running away. Everything pointed to someone who intended to come back home. There were strange leads, too. A woman called in, swearing she'd seen Matilda in a gas station 2 towns over, disoriented and barefoot. Another claimed she'd spoken to her at a train station late at night. Both accounts were investigated and ultimately dismissed. In both instances, the women seen were confirmed not to be Matilda, but they added to the fog false hope that led nowhere. Some began to criticize the local police for not securing the Hacker home more thoroughly in the early hours. By the time crime scene investigators treated it as a potential abduction site, dozens of people had already entered and exited, family, friends, neighbors. Fingerprint and fiber evidence had been contaminated. Whatever trace evidence may have been, it was likely gone. Perhaps most bizarrely, in the weeks that followed, Matilda's email account was accessed once at 2:43 a.m. on April 29th, just over 3 weeks after her disappearance. The IP address traced to a public Wi-Fi network in a rest stop off Route 37, nearly 60 miles away. Nothing was sent, opened, or downloaded. Just logged in, then logged out. Was it her? Someone else who had access? Or someone trying to send a message? The media shifted tone over time from urgent concern to quiet speculation. Was it a kidnapping? A staged disappearance? A mental health crisis no one saw coming? Public interest dwindled, and the case began to slip into the cold file drawer. But not for those closest to Matilda. For them, each unanswered question feels like a door that never quite shuts. Each bit of overlooked evidence, each lead dismissed, feels like another chance missed. And for investigators who still glance at the file now and then, there's an ache that comes from never really knowing how or why someone like Matilda Hacker could simply disappear in a town that doesn't forget easily. When a young woman vanishes with little to no trace, the natural instinct is to look inward toward those closest to her. Many believe the most logical explanation for Matilda Hacker's disappearance lies not in some elaborate, cinematic plot, but in something far more familiar, something that happens behind closed doors. According to this theory, the answer was within her home all along. Matilda's parents, Lydia and Frank Hacker, were regarded as private but polite members of the community. Their family, by all outward appearances, was close-knit. There were no documented domestic disturbances, no history of abuse, no outward tension. But even in the most peaceful homes, things can go unsaid. And some believe that beneath the still surface, something was wrong. Investigators initially cleared Lydia and Frank, based on cooperative interviews and the lack of physical evidence pointing to foul play in the home. But skeptics returned to one key detail, the message Matilda sent to her friend Clara, just hours before she vanished. "I think someone's been in my room again." That one word again implies this wasn't the first time. It suggests a repeated violation of her privacy. Some believe that message was a quiet cry for help. And if so, who would have access to her room without her knowing? Lydia later told investigators she had no idea what the message could have meant. She said Matilda had become more withdrawn lately, especially after turning 20. Frank offered similar comments, noting that Matilda was a little paranoid sometimes, especially about her things. They chalked it up to her stress over school and research. But some find their dismissiveness unsettling. The theory goes something like this. That night, Matilda may have confronted someone, possibly her father, possibly someone else who had access to the house, about the invasion of her privacy. A confrontation escalated. There was no plan to hurt her, but something happened. An accident. Or perhaps something worse. A sudden burst of emotion followed by panic. The absence of struggle, the lack of blood, the pristine state of the house, it all points to a controlled cleanup. If this theory holds weight, whoever was responsible would have had hours before police arrived to remove any trace. Those who support this theory often point to the delay in calling the authorities. Matilda didn't show up to work that morning, a red flag by all accounts. Yet the 911 call wasn't made until nearly 7:20 a.m., despite Lydia reportedly waking up at 6:15. That's a full hour unaccounted for. What was happening during that time? And then there's the missing shoes. Investigators never found them, and they weren't in the house. Could that suggest she left voluntarily? Or were they disposed of along with other evidence in an attempt to stage a departure? The idea that Matilda left on her own is still entertained by some. But again, it clashes with the facts her purse and ID were left behind. Her phone went dead, and there were no travel records or money withdrawals. If she did walk out, she left everything. That's not just strange, it's implausible. Still, this theory has its weaknesses. For one, there's no physical evidence tying her parents or anyone in the household to any wrongdoing. No blood, no signs of a struggle, no neighbors who heard anything suspicious. And if someone in the home did harm Matilda, how did they remove her body without being seen? How did they eliminate all trace evidence in such a short window of time? Moreover, by all accounts, Lydia and Frank seemed genuinely distraught. They participated in every search. They faced the cameras with trembling hands and wet eyes. Lydia, in particular, spoke directly to her daughter during a televised plea. "Matilda, if you're out there, just come home. We love you. We just want you safe." For many viewers, that kind of grief couldn't be faked, so we're left in a difficult place. On one hand, this theory fits a pattern we've seen too often: young women harmed by someone they know and trust, with cases that hinge on what wasn't found. The cryptic message, the missing window of time, the silence, but then there's something that doesn't quite add up. If this was a domestic crime, a moment of violence followed by a cover-up, why take the risk of sending her email account pinging weeks later from a rest stop 60 miles away? Why draw attention back to the case if you've successfully avoided suspicion? That detail doesn't sit comfortably with the idea of a panicked, impulsive act. It hints at something else, a presence that still lingered after the dust had settled. And maybe that's what keeps this theory from being completely satisfying. It might make sense on the surface, but dig deeper, and the cracks start to show. In the end, many still believe this is the most plausible explanation. That someone close to Matilda knows more than they've said. That the truth sits quietly in the spaces between interviews and official reports. But as with every aspect of this case, belief is not the same as proof. And until something concrete emerges, the obvious answer remains just another echo in a house that refuses to speak. There's always that second theory, the one people bring up quietly, almost reluctantly, as if they're not sure they believe it, but they can't quite ignore it either. It lives in the margins of newspaper clippings, whispered across online forums, and passed between locals over late-night coffees. And in Matilda Hacker's case, that theory leads us away from the comfort of logic and into something stranger. Let's begin with the rest stop. Roughly 3 weeks after Matilda vanished, her email account showed activity. It wasn't just a background sync or automated login. According to a tech specialist brought in by the family's private investigator, it was a deliberate sign-in. The IP address traced back to a highway rest stop nearly 60 miles north of our hometown off Interstate 81, in a wooded rural stretch of upstate New York. That alone was enough to reignite the case. Police dispatched units to the location. They searched the area, interviewed staff, reviewed security footage. Nothing came of it. No sightings, no prints, no trace of Matilda or her belongings. But the email login was verified, and here's where things begin to feel off. This wasn't a well-known rest stop. It was small, dated, mostly used by truckers or late-night travelers. No clear reason why Matilda or anyone who might have taken her would go there. And yet, it happened. It's hard not to wonder, was it her? Could it be possible that Matilda was still alive, weeks after everyone assumed the worst? If so, what had happened to her? And more chillingly, was she alone? Some speculate that Matilda may have been abducted, not by someone she knew, but by a stranger who had been watching her. One forum user, who claimed to live just 2 towns over, mentioned a string of unsettling incidents from the months leading up to her disappearance. Unconfirmed, but compelling. Reports of young women receiving strange calls at night. Footsteps in yards. A figure seen watching from the woods near bus stops. Nothing was ever officially linked. But there's a dark kind of thread here, one that's easy to dismiss until you start connecting the dots. Could it be possible that someone had been following Matilda? That the person who had been in her room again wasn't someone in her house, but someone who found a way in from the outside? This theory suggests a far more terrifying scenario. That Matilda's disappearance wasn't spontaneous or emotional, but premeditated. That someone had studied her routines, her weaknesses, her moments of solitude. Maybe they waited, watched, and when the moment was right, acted. If that's true, the rest stop login could be their way of signaling control. Or a cruel game. Or perhaps a mistake. A slip in judgment that left a faint trail. And if it was Matilda logging in under watch, under duress, it may have been her only act of defiance. A flicker in the dark, just enough to be seen. Others point to the local legend that clung to the nearby town of Marston Hill, just 20 minutes from that same rest stop. Stories of abandoned cabins, of strange disappearances dating back decades. It's the kind of folklore you hear in sleepy towns, the stuff of campfire tales. But it's curious that more than one tip led investigators toward that area, even if nothing concrete was ever found. Of course, without evidence, this theory teeters dangerously close to speculation. There's no proof of a stalker, no official sightings, no surveillance that captures a strange car or unknown figure outside Matilda's home. And yet, it's difficult to ignore the way this theory tugs at a different fear. The fear of the unknown. The fear that someone out there can make you disappear without leaving a trace. It's unsettling because it breaks the pattern. Crimes of opportunity are supposed to be messy, impulsive. But this, if true, was clean, silent. A vanishing that defies everything we understand about forensic detection. The unsettling theory doesn't ask us to believe in the paranormal. It doesn't require ghosts or conspiracies. Just one person, one predator, someone quiet enough, patient enough, and skilled enough to walk into someone's life and out again without ever being seen. No fingerprints, no sound, no goodbye. And the hardest part? That theory leaves us with no resolution. If she was taken by someone like that, we may never know. Not unless they make a mistake again. Not unless Matilda finds a way to leave another flicker behind. So we're left to sit with the possibility that maybe the person responsible was never in the Hacker household. That maybe Matilda's story isn't just a tragedy, it's a warning. A reminder that even in the safety of our routines, there are still shadows watching. And sometimes they do. There's a moment in every unsolved case where the silence becomes louder than the noise ever was. Where the buzz of theories, interviews, and tips quiets into something more haunting absence. For Matilda Hacker, that silence came quietly. Not with a headline or a final discovery, Just time, time passing, time stretching, and with it, the realization that the answers may never come. In the early weeks, the investigation felt urgent. Detectives followed every possible lead. Her face was on posters, community bulletin boards, morning news reports. The hope was still there, and hope that she'd turn up, that this was just a misunderstanding, or maybe even a cry for help. But weeks became months, then a year, and the longer she stayed missing, the more difficult it became to keep the case alive. Eventually, the trail just thinned. Witnesses moved away. Tips dried up. Evidence grew colder in boxes stored on dusty shelves. And with no body, no confirmed sightings, and no suspect ever charged, the case simply stalled, another file in the growing archive of unsolved mysteries. There were, and still are, so many unanswered questions. Who entered her room that night? Why were there no signs of forced entry? What happened to her journal, her favorite scarf, or her phone, all of which were never found? How did someone, if it was someone, manage to take her without waking anyone in the house? And if she left of her own will, why? Why leave everything and everyone behind without a word? These questions hang heavy in the air, not just for investigators, but for those who knew and loved her. For Matilda's mother, Ruth, the unanswered questions are like a second loss and echo of grief that never settles. In interviews over the years, Ruth described it as losing her over and over again. Every morning she doesn't walk through the door. Her father, Alan, became more private as time wore on. After several years of leading community searches and press interviews, he quietly stepped back. Friends say it was the weight of it all, the pressure to stay hopeful while navigating the devastating unknown. And for Matilda's younger sister, Jenna, the silence created a different kind of grief. She once said, "I just want to know something. Even if it's terrible, I want to stop wondering." That's what makes cold cases so cruel. It's not just the not knowing, it's the never knowing when, or if, the knowing will ever come. Still, over the years, a few moments reignited hope. A handwritten postcard arrived at Ruth's house in 2016, 8 years after Matilda's disappearance. No return address. Just 4 words. "I didn't forget you." Authorities examined it for fingerprints and DNA. Nothing usable. Was it Matilda? Was it someone playing a cruel game? Or was it something else entirely? They never found out. Then in 2019, an anonymous tip was phoned in to a Pennsylvania crime line. The caller claimed Matilda had been spotted at a women's shelter under a false name. Police followed up. Interviews were conducted. But the woman in question wasn't Matilda. Another dead end. In 2022, a local podcast aired a 4-part series on Matilda's disappearance. It brought fresh attention to the case, new listeners, new speculation, even a few old witnesses who came forward again. One man claimed he saw a woman matching Matilda's description boarding a Greyhound bus in Albany just days after she vanished. The timeline was shaky, the source unreliable, but it reminded people that the case was still open, still waiting. To this day, Matilda Hacker's file remains active with the state's Missing Persons Unit. No one has ever been declared a suspect. No body has been found. No death certificate issued. It's one of those cases that sits quietly in the back of the public's mind, brought up in conversations that begin with, "Remember that girl who just disappeared?" But for the people closest to her, it never left. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't the presence of evil. It's the absence of anything at all. No sounds, no answers. Just a question mark hanging in the place where a life used to be, and so the trail grows cold, not because no one cared, but because no one knew where to go next. Thank you for walking with us through the quiet, haunting mystery of Matilda Hacker. These kinds of stories don't always have neat endings. Sometimes All we're left with are echoes of a life once lived, of a family still waiting, and of a question that still lingers in the shadows. Have you heard of Matilda's case before today? Or do you know something that wasn't covered in this episode? If so, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes, even the smallest recollection can bring light to the forgotten corners of a cold case. If you found this story compelling, we invite you to subscribe for more true crime cases like this one. Quiet investigations that look beyond the headlines and into the hearts of those left behind. We focus on unsolved mysteries, forgotten stories, and chilling disappearances that still echo across time. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, some stories never truly end. They just wait to be heard again.